3 hours after burying my husband, I stood on my parents' porch and heard my father say, "She doesn't need to know the estate's value. She isn't even sane enough to keep it." I didn't cry or storm inside. I simply hit record. The reality was far worse than them just wanting his $4 million. They were already building a legal file to prove in court that I was mentally unfit to control my own life. I am Abigail Parker, at 36 years old. I found myself standing over an open grave, burying the only man who had ever truly understood me. Grant Parker was gone. It was a ruptured aorta. The doctors at the emergency room told me it happened entirely too fast. There was zero chance of saving him. One moment we were sitting at our kitchen table drinking black coffee. And the next, the foundation of my entire world simply collapsed. The funeral was held in Portland, Oregon, under a heavy, oppressive sky that spat a continuous, freezing drizzle over the cemetery. The green canopy over the gravesite offered little protection from the biting dampness. Looking around, I saw a massive crowd. Dozens of Grant's co-workers from the engineering and logistics firm had shown up. Standing shoulder to shoulder in their dark woolen coats, holding black umbrellas, bowing their heads in quiet, genuine respect. He was loved. He was respected. But as I sat in the front row, staring blankly at the polished wood of his casket, my eyes kept drifting to the right. There were 3 empty chairs beside me. They had been reserved for my family. My father, Russell, my mother, Elaine, my younger sister, Brianna. They were completely absent. There was no phone call beforehand to explain a delay. There was no apologetic text message. There was nothing but a deafening silence. I was in a state of absolute physical and mental exhaustion, my bones feeling heavy and hollow all at once. Yet, even through the thick, suffocating fog of fresh grief, I possessed enough sharp lucidity to realize their absence was not some normal logistical glitch. It was a deliberate choice. You do not simply miss your son-in-law's funeral by accident. The morning after I laid my husband in the ground, I received a phone call summoning me to a law office downtown. The dampness from the cemetery still felt baked into my skin as I sat in a quiet, mahogany-paneled room. The man sitting across the wide desk was Malcolm Reed, an estate attorney. I stared at him with blank confusion. I had been married to Grant for 8 years, and I had absolutely no idea he had ever hired legal counsel. Grant was a man who lived with unapologetic simplicity. He wore flannel shirts until the elbows wore completely thin. He drove a 10-year-old truck that rattled whenever he pushed it past 60 miles per hour on the highway. We lived a quiet, unassuming life. Malcolm folded his hands on top of a thick manila folder. He did not offer me empty, sympathetic platitudes. Instead, he offered the cold, hard reality of paper. In a measured, steady voice, Malcolm announced that Grant had left his entire estate to me. I nodded, expecting to hear about our modest savings account and the life insurance policy provided by his employer. Then, Malcolm read the total valuation. It was a figure of approximately $4 million. The air instantly vanished from the room. I gripped the armrests of my leather chair, my mind struggling to process the words. $4 million. Malcolm began to list the assets, each one hitting me like a physical blow of shock. Grant had quietly acquired a small mixed-use commercial building in a rapidly developing neighborhood of Portland. He owned a secluded coastal cabin surrounded by pine trees near Cannon Beach. He possessed a heavily diversified portfolio of municipal bonds. Most surprisingly, he held a significant percentage of equity in a highly profitable private logistics company. I sat there completely paralyzed. The twist of it all was almost too much to bear. My quiet, unpretentious husband, who always checked the price tags on groceries and repaired his own plumbing, had been silently acting as an architect of our future. He had secretly built a rock-solid, impenetrable financial fortress around me, ensuring I would never have to struggle for a single day of the rest of my life. Malcolm paused, letting the magnitude of the wealth settle over me. Then, he leaned forward. The professional, detached demeanor of an attorney vanished, replaced by a dark, cautious intensity. His voice dropped an octave, cutting through my shock. He warned me, choosing his words with razor-sharp precision. He told me that grief makes people incredibly vulnerable, and sudden wealth makes the people around them incredibly predatory. He explicitly instructed me that if anyone, be it family, friend, or stranger, began asking detailed questions about the estate, or if anyone tried to rush me into signing any legal or financial documents while I was submerged in mourning, I was to refuse immediately. I was to call him before putting ink to a single piece of paper. The gravity in his eyes sent a deep chill down my spine. I left Malcolm's office in a profound daze. The Portland rain had stopped, leaving the city slick and gray. I was a widow, alone, holding a massive secret I never asked to bear. By the time evening draped the city in shadows, the silence of my own house became absolutely unbearable. I needed an anchor, despite the glaring, unforgivable absence of my parents and sister at the cemetery. The primal, bruised part of my heart took over. I rationalized their absence. I told myself there had to be a valid excuse, a medical emergency, a severe misunderstanding. I just desperately wanted my mother to wrap her arms around me. I wanted my father to pat my shoulder and tell me I was going to survive this nightmare. I wanted to share this confusing, overwhelming news about Grant's will, hoping it would bring us together in my darkest hour. I decided to drive across town to their house. I just wanted a kind word. I had absolutely no idea I was walking directly into a trap. I pulled into their driveway just past 8 o'clock in the evening. The suburban neighborhood was quiet, with only the hum of streetlights breaking the silence. I walked up the familiar concrete steps to their front porch. The lights were blazing inside, casting a warm, deceptive, golden glow through the front windows. I reached out, resting my fingers firmly against the cold brass handle of the screen door. I was 1 second away from pulling it open and stepping inside. Then I heard my name from the dining room. I froze with my hand still on the latch. The inner wooden door was cracked open just enough to let the evening air move through the house, and the gap carried every word straight to the porch. My fingers were literally trembling against the cold metal of the screen door when I heard my father speak my name. The wooden front door was cracked open just a few inches to let the evening breeze cycle through the house, acting as a perfect acoustic funnel. I froze on the welcome mat, the breath trapping itself instantly in my throat. Inside the dining room, my father, Russell Holt, was not speaking with the hushed, reverent tone of a man mourning his recently deceased son-in-law. His voice was sharp, animated, and entirely transactional. He told the room that he had spent the last 4 hours digging through public tax assessments and county property records online. He proudly announced that he had managed to calculate a rough estimate of the total assets. He said Grant had left every single penny to me. Before the weight of his invasion of my privacy could even fully register, my younger sister, Brianna, cut in. Her tone was dripping with practical, sneering disdain. She stated flatly that I was going to ruin everything. She told our parents that I was far too weak and fragile to handle that kind of wealth, adding a cruel remark that I had never even successfully managed a personal budget for a single financial quarter in my entire adult life. She spoke about me as if I were a clueless, incompetent child who had accidentally stumbled upon a winning lottery ticket. I closed my eyes, a sickening wave of nausea washing over my empty stomach. I desperately wanted to believe they were just speaking out of misguided concern, a clumsy attempt to protect me from the overwhelming burden Malcolm Reed had just warned me about. Then, my mother, Elaine, spoke. The sound of her voice shattered my reality into thousands of irreparable pieces. I heard the delicate clink of her wine glass hitting the wooden dining table. She told my father and sister that they needed to look at the undeniable reality of their situation. She actually said that Grant passing away was obviously a terrible tragedy, but it was also the absolute best opportunity this family was ever going to get to finally pull themselves out of their crushing, suffocating mountain of debt. My mother viewed my husband's sudden, violent death as a financial escape hatch. My tragedy was their winning ticket. My mother viewed my husband's sudden death as a financial escape hatch. The conversation did not stop at morbid greed. It rapidly descended into a calculated, predatory strategy. Russell lowered his voice, adopting the tone of a man sealing a backroom deal. He revealed that he had already made a discreet phone call to an old acquaintance of his, a man named Dr. Victor Hale. My father explained that Dr. Hale was willing to sign a formal medical declaration without even requiring an in-person psychiatric evaluation. According to my father, this doctor would officially certify that I was fundamentally incapacitated, completely unable to make rational, independent decisions due to the severe psychological trauma of losing my husband. My blood ran completely cold. I stood paralyzed on the porch, the freezing wind whipping through my thin sweater, as I listened to my own flesh and blood plot to strip away my basic human autonomy. Brianna enthusiastically picked up the thread of the plan. She proudly announced that she had already begun drafting the paperwork to file a petition for emergency guardianship and a full conservatorship. Her goal was to present the medical declaration to a judge so that she, my younger sister, would be legally appointed to take absolute control over Grant's entire estate instead of me. She did not intend to stop at just holding the money. Brianna openly bragged to our parents that she had already made a preliminary phone call to a luxury real estate broker regarding the coastal cabin near Cannon Beach. She had initiated contact with a broker before she had a single ounce of legal authority, before the dirt on Grant's grave had even settled. She confidently told my father that the broker guaranteed they could get the property listed on the market within 14 days and have a wealthy cash buyer secured in less than 1 month. This was not a spontaneous conversation born out of panic or sudden temptation. This was a highly premeditated, meticulously structured legal and financial ambush. They had been planning this while I was picking out the casket. They had been making these phone calls while I was standing in the pouring rain, crying over a freshly dug hole in the earth. My first, visceral instinct was to throw the screen door violently open. I wanted to storm into that brightly lit dining room, flip the table, and scream until my voice gave out. I wanted to demand how they could possibly do this to me. I wanted to shame them, to cry, to beg them to love me enough to stop, but I did not move forward. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. The paralyzing grief that had been suffocating me for the last 4 days suddenly crystallized into something entirely different. It turned into pure, crystalline ice. The warning words of the estate attorney echoed loudly in my mind. My hands stopped trembling. I reached into the deep pocket of my coat and pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen, opened the voice memo application, and pressed the large red recording button. I held the microphone directly up to the gap in the doorframe. I stood there in the freezing darkness for exactly 4 minutes and 20 seconds. I did not make a single sound. I let the phone capture every single piece of their horrifying conversation. I recorded my father confirming the corrupt doctor's name again. I recorded my sister outlining her timeline to seize the bank accounts. I recorded my mother talking about how they could use the liquidated bonds to pay off the second mortgage on their house. When the conversation shifted to what they were going to order for dessert, I quietly tapped the screen, stopped the recording, and saved the audio file to a secure cloud server. I turned my back on the house. I walked down the concrete steps with careful, silent precision, ensuring my shoes did not scrape against the pavement. I got into my car, started the engine without turning on the headlights, and drove away into the Portland night. I did not shed a single tear on the drive home. I did not call them to confront their betrayal. This was the exact moment my entire psychological landscape shifted. My default reflex was no longer to beg my parents for affection or understanding. My reflex was to secure the chain of evidence. Later that night, I sat alone on the hardwood floor of my living room. The house was painfully quiet. Hanging on the coat rack near the front door was Grant's heavy canvas jacket. The fabric still carried the faint, familiar scent of cedarwood and motor oil. I pulled my knees to my chest, pressed play on my phone, and listened to the recording of my family plotting my demise. The audio played clearly through the silent room. The voices of my parents and sisters sounding like complete strangers. As the recording finished and the room fell back into a heavy silence, a profound, devastating realization washed over me. The true loss I suffered this week was not just the devastating death of the man I loved, it was the absolute, undeniable death of the illusion I had held about my own blood family. I was entirely alone in the world now. Grant had given me the financial weapons to survive, and my family had just handed me the exact blueprint of their attack. I was no longer a grieving widow desperately seeking comfort. I was a woman preparing for war. At 6 o'clock the next morning, I picked up my phone and dialed the only person I trusted to make sense of the nightmare I had recorded. Nora Keene was not just my closest friend. She had spent 10 years working as a senior legal document specialist in the county probate division. She was not a barred attorney, but she understood how the probate system actually worked better than almost anyone in the city. I played the captured audio file for her over the speakerphone. Listening to my parents and sister scheme in the cold light of day, I expected Nora to gasp. I expected her to offer me the profound, emotional sympathy I was so desperately craving. Instead, Nora exhaled sharply, the sound highly professional and entirely detached. I could hear the rhythmic clacking of her keyboard through the line. She told me to instantly stop looking at this as a heartbreaking family betrayal. She stripped away the emotional devastation and reframed the entire situation with chilling clarity. In the eyes of the law, she explained, this was an attempted hostile financial takeover. She categorized their conversation clinically: conspiracy to commit medical fraud and premeditated abuse of the guardianship process. Nora stated that my family was trying to weaponize my natural mourning period, planning to use my tears as legally binding evidence of mental instability. She ordered me to get the audio file to my estate lawyer that very second. By 8:15 in the morning, I was sitting in my car in my driveway, forwarding the encrypted digital file directly to Malcolm Reed. Exactly 10 minutes later, my phone rang. Malcolm did not waste a single breath on pleasantries or condolences. He confirmed the audio had major strategic value, even if admissibility could be contested. While covert recordings often faced complicated admissibility rules, depending on the specific judicial jurisdiction, it gave us the exact, undeniable roadmap of their attack. Malcolm shifted into a mode of terrifying efficiency. He informed me that he was immediately drafting a formal preemptive objection to file with the county probate court. He explained the strategy in plain terms. This document acted as a legal tripwire. If my sister or father attempted to file an emergency ex parte petition to seize control of my life, the judge would instantly see Malcolm's objection sitting on the docket, signaling a contested estate. Furthermore, he filed a strict, binding demand that every single notice, summons, or legal filing regarding my name had to be formally served directly to his law office and my personal residence. They could no longer operate in the shadows. They could no longer whisper to a judge behind my back. However, Malcolm knew a preemptive strike was merely a stalling tactic. We needed an impenetrable shield. He told me that defending against a medical declaration required superior medical evidence. He urgently referred me to Dr. Lena Mercer, an independent forensic psychiatrist who specialized in adult competency evaluations for the courts. He utilized his connections to book me an emergency appointment for 2 o'clock that same afternoon. I walked into Dr. Mercer's clinical, brightly lit office expecting a cold, adversarial interrogation. Instead, I found a profoundly rigorous but deeply humane process. The evaluation lasted for 3 grueling hours. Dr. Mercer did not patronize me. She did not treat me like a fragile glass doll. She asked me hard, direct questions about my psychological state, and I chose absolute, unvarnished honesty. I admitted that I was only sleeping for 2 hours a night. I confessed that I randomly started hyperventilating when I saw Grant's work boots sitting by the back door. I told her the grief felt like a literal physical weight crushing my ribs, but when the assessment pivoted to executive function and situational awareness, I shifted gears completely. Dr. Mercer asked me to explain my financial landscape. I calmly and accurately detailed the commercial building, the coastal real estate, the municipal bonds, and the private equity shares. I clearly articulated my understanding of property taxes, basic asset liability, and my immediate plan to rely on fiduciary professionals to manage the portfolio. I completed her cognitive tests flawlessly. I demonstrated perfect memory retention, logical contingency planning, and an absolute, unshakable grip on reality. By 5 o'clock in the evening, Dr. Mercer handed me a signed, freshly printed document on heavy stock paper. Her medical conclusion was legally bulletproof. She thoroughly documented that I was experiencing acute, normal bereavement. However, she explicitly stated in bold lettering that I exhibited 0 signs of psychosis, absolutely no cognitive decline, and possessed no impairment whatsoever to my legal capacity or self-management skills. I was a grieving widow, but I was 100% legally competent to direct my own life. I drove the completed evaluation directly back to Malcolm's office. He read the report, nodded once with grim satisfaction, and handed the original back to me. He looked me dead in the eye and delivered a harsh, defining lesson in modern legal warfare. He told me that inside a courtroom, the fundamental truth means absolutely nothing if it is not properly formatted, preserved, and filed. He explicitly instructed me to purchase a fireproof lockbox to secure the physical original. He then ordered me to scan a high-resolution digital copy, email it to myself to establish a verified electronic timestamp, and upload it to a secure encrypted cloud drive. Clean, meticulously organized paperwork, he stated bluntly, was just as important as the truth itself. Driving home that evening, the heavy Oregon rain began to fall again, slicking the dark asphalt. I stopped at a red light and let my head rest against the leather steering wheel. The frantic, adrenaline-fueled pace of the last 12 hours finally caught up with my exhausted body. I thought about Grant. I thought about how he had lived so quietly, never wearing flashy clothes, never once boasting about his brilliant investments. By keeping the reality of our wealth a total secret from my family all those years, he had inadvertently blinded them to my current strength. My parents and my sister thought they were ambushing a clueless, penniless, easily broken woman. They had absolutely no idea I possessed the financial resources to hire a top-tier estate lawyer and a forensic psychiatrist within a matter of hours. The traffic light turned green, casting a bright glow across my dashboard. A painful, beautiful clarity settled deep into my chest as I pressed the accelerator. Grant had not just left me a massive fortune to live comfortably. By building this fortress in secret, my husband had left me the most valuable tactical advantage of all. He had left me the time to learn exactly how to fight back. The phone rang at 10 o'clock the following morning. When I saw my mother's name flash across the screen, my stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. I let it ring 3 times before I answered, forcing my voice to sound weak and hollow. Elaine spoke with a thick, sugary sweetness that made my skin crawl. She cooed into the receiver, telling me that a house is entirely too large and empty for a woman sitting alone in her grief. She invited me over for dinner that evening, emphasizing over and over that the family simply wanted to wrap their arms around me and take care of my fragile state. As soon as the call ended, I immediately dialed Nora. I told her I was going to decline the invitation. I was terrified I would look across the dining table and scream the truth right into their faces. Nora flatly rejected my hesitation. She ordered me to attend the dinner. She explained that going into the lion's den was the only way to gather actionable intelligence. My objective was to play the exact role they expected me to play. I needed to act like a devastated, helpless widow. Nora instructed me to keep my mouth shut, observe every single micro-expression, and watch for any behavioral leaks that would reveal their next tactical move. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6:30 in the evening. The moment I walked through the front door, I realized I was stepping onto a meticulously designed theatrical stage. The dining room table was set with the good china. The air was heavy with the smell of baked ziti and garlic bread, which had been my absolute favorite comfort meal when I was 10 years old. It was a calculated sensory manipulation. My father, a man who had never served anyone but himself for his entire adult life, stood up the moment I entered. He walked around the table, pulled out my chair, and gently pushed it back in as I sat down. He then picked up a heavy glass pitcher and poured ice water into my goblet. The unnatural domesticity of the gesture sent a sharp spike of adrenaline straight into my bloodstream. I kept my eyes cast downward, maintaining the illusion of absolute exhaustion. Halfway through the meal, Russell initiated the main act. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and adopted the tone of a deeply concerned, benevolent patriarch. He softly suggested that we needed to have a brief conversation about responsibility. He told me that managing a sudden, massive financial portfolio was an incredibly dangerous labyrinth for someone without a background in corporate finance. He used words like tax liabilities, municipal penalties, and structural depreciation. He said one single mistake on a piece of government paperwork could cost me everything. Then, he delivered the punchline. He gently offered to step in and take over the administrative burden temporarily, just until I found my footing. Before I could even formulate a non-committal response, Elaine executed the emotional pincer movement. She reached across the tablecloth and placed her warm hand firmly over mine. Her eyes were wide and swimming with manufactured sympathy. She told me that I needed to prioritize healing my broken spirit above all else. She whispered that money was a toxic stressor, and that she was genuinely terrified I was going to suffer a complete psychological collapse if I tried to carry the weight of the estate alone. She was practically begging me to surrender, wrapping her venom in the warm blanket of maternal concern. I nodded slowly, withdrawing my hand from hers under the guise of reaching for my napkin. I told them I was just so overwhelmingly tired. A statement that was completely true, though not for the reasons they believed, while my parents delivered their synchronized monologues. I watched my younger sister out of the corner of my eye. Brianna barely touched her food. She did not say a single word of comfort. Instead, she kept her phone resting on her lap beneath the edge of the table. Her thumb moved in a rapid, continuous blur. The faint blue light from the screen occasionally reflected off her silver necklace. She was not simply disengaged. She was actively coordinating something behind the digital curtain, communicating with the outside world while our parents kept my attention focused on the dinner plates. When the dessert was cleared, I stood up and excused myself to use the restroom down the hall. My heart pounded relentlessly against my ribs. I walked past the guest bathroom and continued silently down the carpeted corridor toward my father's home office. The heavy oak door was pushed ajar by about 2 inches. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the window blinds. I slipped inside, my breathing shallow and controlled. The top of his mahogany desk was cluttered with printed emails and yellow legal pads. Right in the center, sitting on top of a leather binder, was a thick manila envelope. I pulled my phone from my pocket and turned the brightness all the way down. I engaged the silent mode to ensure the camera shutter would not make a sound. I held the device over the envelope and tapped the screen to focus. The harsh glare of the camera flash was disabled, but there was enough ambient light to capture the bright red ink stamped across the top right corner of the document protruding from the flap. It was an official intake stamp from the county probate court. I snapped 3 high-resolution photographs. I carefully backed out of the office, walked into the restroom, flushed the toilet, and returned to the living room to say my final goodbyes. I thanked them profusely for the wonderful meal. Maintaining the facade until the very second I closed my car door, the moment I was parked safely in my own driveway, I sent the images directly to Malcolm Reed. I sat in the dark interior of my car, waiting. It took him exactly 14 minutes to call me back. When I answered, his voice lacked its usual measured calmness. It was clipped and urgent. Malcolm had used the docket number visible in my photograph to access the county's secure electronic filing portal. He confirmed my absolute worst fear. The envelope on my father's desk was not a draft. It was a receipt. My family had officially filed the petition for emergency guardianship. Furthermore, Malcolm saw the digital attachments linked to the case file. They had already submitted the medical certificate signed by Dr. Victor Hale. A cold, horrifying realization washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. When I stood on their porch listening to them scheme, I thought I was overhearing the initial planning phase of a future attack. I was completely wrong. As I sat at their dining table listening to them talk about temporarily helping me, they were putting on a show for a victim who was already bleeding. They were not planning to steal my autonomy. They had already filed the paperwork to do it 4 days ago. They were far ahead of me, and I had just realized it. The phone ringing shattered the quiet of my kitchen on Tuesday morning. The caller ID displayed the name of the property management company that handled the mixed-use commercial building in Portland. I answered, forcing my voice to remain steady. The senior property manager sounded intensely uncomfortable. He apologized profusely for bothering me during my period of bereavement, but explained he needed to urgently verify a highly unusual administrative request. Less than an hour prior, a woman identifying herself as Brianna Holt had contacted their corporate office. She explicitly introduced herself as my newly appointed legal guardian. My knuckles turned completely white as I gripped the edge of the granite counter. The manager explained that Brianna had forcefully demanded that all future rental disbursements from the commercial tenants be immediately redirected to a newly established routing number at a different financial institution. To bypass his initial skepticism, my sister had coldly read aloud the exact filing number of the emergency guardianship petition, rattling off the court docket digits with absolute, chilling authority. She was actively utilizing the pending legal filing as a weapon of intimidation, projecting the illusion of established, court-ordered control over my assets before a judge had even looked at the case. I told the manager to freeze all account changes immediately and instructed him to confer directly with my legal counsel. The moment I disconnected, I dialed Malcolm. He did not express shock. He simply shifted into a gear of ruthless legal aggression. Within 45 minutes, Malcolm dispatched a formal certified warning letter to the property management firm's legal department. He clearly outlined that no judicial decree existed, that I maintained absolute sole ownership of the property, and he officially logged my sister's phone call as a documented incident of impersonating legal authority to actively intercept private cash flow. The sheer audacity of her move left me breathless, but the escalation was only just beginning. 2 days later, my personal cell phone buzzed with a call from the Human Resources Department at Northline Civic Design, the urban planning firm where I had worked for the past 7 years. The director of personnel spoke with a strained, agonizingly delicate tone. She informed me that they had received a deeply concerning phone call from a family member claiming that I was experiencing a severe psychological breakdown. This relative had strongly suggested that the company needed to temporarily adjust my access to my payroll, direct deposits, and health benefits, allegedly to protect me from squandering my resources while I was mentally unstable. This was a horrifying, distinct escalation. Brianna was no longer just hunting for the real estate and the investment portfolios Grant had left behind. She was actively trying to sever my independent, professional livelihood by attempting to freeze my salary and manipulate my human resources file. She was meticulously engineering a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they could successfully cut off my personal income, I would eventually default on my own daily bills, which they would then eagerly present to a judge as definitive, undeniable proof that I was a woman who could no longer survive on her own. The psychological warfare continued on Friday afternoon. My father arrived unannounced at my front door, holding a thin manila folder. He wore a soft, paternal smile that did not quite reach the cold corners of his eyes. He stepped into the hallway and handed me a small stack of stapled papers, casually describing them as a simple, temporary authorization form. He claimed it would merely allow him to handle the upcoming property taxes and update the insurance premiums so I could focus entirely on resting my mind. He clicked a pen and held it out to me, his body language casually but firmly pressuring me to sign on the bottom line right then and there. I leaned heavily against the wall, channeling every single ounce of exhaustion I possessed to maintain my carefully constructed facade. I told him the dense legal jargon was giving me a massive headache and asked if I could just keep the papers on the kitchen counter to read after I took a long nap. Deep annoyance briefly flashed across his face, but he forced a tight nod, unwilling to break his character of the deeply caring, protective father. The second his car backed out of my driveway, I laid the documents flat on my dining table and photographed every single page under the bright overhead light. I forwarded the digital images to Malcolm. His response was swift and deeply cynical. The document was absolutely not a limited authorization for taxes. It was a comprehensive, general power of attorney. If I had put my signature on that final page, I would have instantly granted Russell sweeping, unrestricted authority to empty my bank accounts, sell my real estate, and liquidate every single bond Grant had secured. Furthermore, Malcolm ran a quick background check on the law firm listed on the letterhead. The attorney who had drafted the predatory document was an old, morally flexible business associate of my father from a failed real estate venture a decade ago. The walls felt like they were rapidly closing in around me, the sheer volume and speed of their attacks threatening to pull me under the surface. I called Nora, my voice trembling with the overwhelming weight of the siege. She arrived at my house within 30 minutes, carrying a thick binder, colored highlighters, and a fresh legal notepad. She sat me down at the table and forced me to stop reacting emotionally. Nora systematically transformed my spiraling panic into a rigid, clinical methodology. Together, we built a comprehensive event log. We meticulously recorded the exact date and time of every single hostile interaction. We logged the property manager's phone call, the human resources incident, the fraudulent guardianship filing, and my father's deceitful attempt to secure a general power of attorney. We listed the names and direct contact numbers of the corporate witnesses who had received these manipulative calls. Under Nora's brilliant direction, the chaotic nightmare of my family's betrayal was condensed into a neat, devastatingly chronological legal timeline. As I stared down at the completed spreadsheet, a profound, suffocating realization settled heavily on my chest. My family was executing a highly coordinated, multi-front war against my entire existence. They were simultaneously attacking my financial assets, systematically destroying my professional reputation, undermining my career stability, and attempting to legally erase my fundamental autonomy. They were trying to bury me alive under a mountain of paperwork and fabricated concern, entirely confident that I would simply suffocate in the dark before I even realized I was in a coffin. Nora arrived at my house on Wednesday evening with a large insulated thermos of black coffee and her heavy silver laptop. She had spent her entire lunch break and the better part of the afternoon accessing public county databases, property tax portals, and the municipal civil litigation registry. She sat at my dining room table, opening tabs with the cold, practiced efficiency of a seasoned auditor. I pulled up a chair beside her, completely unprepared for the devastating financial autopsy she was about to present. The picture of the Holt family finances was exponentially worse than a few missed bills or a temporary cash flow problem. My parents were standing on the edge of an absolute financial cliff, and the ground was actively crumbling beneath their feet. Nora pulled up the deed and mortgage history for my childhood home. Russell had not just taken out a second mortgage, he had layered a third home equity line of credit on top of the property, leveraging the house to its absolute maximum limit to fund a series of catastrophic commercial real estate investments that had completely vaporized over the last 36 months. To make matters infinitely worse, Nora found 2 active mechanics' liens filed against him by independent construction contractors who were preparing to sue him for tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid labor and materials. Elaine was not an innocent, oblivious bystander in this ruin. Nora pointed a perfectly manicured finger at a downloaded loan agreement. My mother's signature sat right next to my father's on the most toxic, high-interest commercial loan in the stack, if Russell defaulted, which looked mathematically inevitable within the next 60 to 90 days. Elaine would be dragged down right alongside him. The bank would foreclose on the house she loved so fiercely. Her pristine credit score would be absolutely obliterated, and the comfortable, upper-middle-class illusion she had spent 40 years cultivating would be completely destroyed. Then, Nora opened a separate browser window dedicated to Brianna. My younger sister always presented herself flawlessly, wearing imported Italian leather shoes and carrying designer handbags that cost more than my first car. The reality beneath the luxury was grotesque. Brianna was drowning in revolving credit card debt. Nora found an active, unresolved debt collection lawsuit filed against her in the municipal court by a major national bank. Even more pathetic, the public records indicated a trail of defaults on dozens of short-term, buy-now-pay-later microloans. Brianna was financing her lavish lifestyle a few $100s at a time, and the bill had finally come due. I sat back in my chair, staring at the glowing screen. The sickening, visceral knot in my stomach finally uncoiled, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I was not the weak, fragile child they were desperately trying to protect. I was the emergency exit. I was the $4 million fire extinguisher they needed to put out the blazing inferno of their own catastrophic failures. My husband's death was merely a timely coincidence for a family that was exactly 1/4 away from total, irreversible bankruptcy. As Nora closed her laptop, my phone vibrated gently against the wooden table. It was a text message from a woman I used to play tennis with 3 years ago. The message read that she was praying for me because she heard from my sister that I was refusing to eat, entirely unable to sleep, and wandering around my house in a total daze. 10 minutes later, another message arrived from a former coworker of Grant, saying almost the exact same thing. A calculated, highly aggressive smear campaign was actively unfolding across my social circle. Brianna was methodically planting seeds of doubt, ensuring that if anyone checked on me, they would view my normal grief through the distorted lens of severe mental instability. She was actively building a chorus of witnesses to validate the fraudulent medical certificate she had already submitted to the probate judge. My fingers flew across the keyboard. I wanted to type out a furious paragraph explaining the truth, exposing my sister as a manipulative liar. Nora reached over and clamped her hand firmly over my wrist, stopping me before I could hit send. She explained the psychological trap with brutal precision. She warned me that firing back rapid, highly emotional, defensive text messages would play perfectly into Brianna's hands. Any aggressive denial would instantly be interpreted by outsiders as manic, unhinged behavior. Nora instructed me to drain every single drop of emotion from my responses. I needed to reply with short, polite, boring sentences. I deleted my furious paragraph and typed a simple reply stating I was resting, grieving quietly, and deeply appreciated their kind thoughts. No anger, no defensiveness, just a calm, polite wall of absolute sanity. The final, devastating piece of the puzzle arrived an hour later. Sarah, my oldest friend from college, called me. She did not offer vague condolences. She sounded deeply disturbed. Sarah revealed that Brianna had called her the previous afternoon, pretending to cry. But the tears quickly dried up when Brianna started interrogating Sarah about my banking history. My sister had actively pressed Sarah for the names of the financial institutions Grant and I used, inquiring about my daily spending habits and whether I kept large amounts of cash in the house. This had absolutely nothing to do with ensuring my physical or mental well-being. Brianna was explicitly conducting reconnaissance. She was hunting for account numbers. She was mapping out the terrain of my financial life to ensure a smooth, immediate seizure the second the judge granted her the conservatorship. I ended the call with Sarah and walked over to the kitchen window. Staring out into the dark, rain-soaked street, a deep, profound ache settled in my chest. It was the unique, isolating pain of realizing the people who raised you were drowning, genuinely suffocating under the weight of their own terrible choices. I felt a flicker of absolute pity for the desperate panic my father must feel staring at those foreclosure notices, but as I watched a pair of headlights cut through the darkness outside, the pity hardened into something unbreakable. I understood their desperation. I saw the absolute terror driving their actions. Yet, a clear, insurmountable boundary formed in my mind. Financial desperation did not give them the right to steal my agency. Fear did not magically legalize the theft of my autonomy. They were drowning, but I absolutely refused to let them hold my head underwater just so they could catch a single breath. Thursday morning. The atmosphere shifted from defensive maneuvering to offensive strategy. Malcolm arranged a strictly confidential meeting at his downtown office. When I arrived at exactly 9 o'clock, another man was already sitting at the conference table. Malcolm introduced him as Detective Elijah Stone, a senior investigator for the county's Economic Crimes Division, specifically tasked with handling complex financial fraud, targeting vulnerable adults. Elijah did not wear a tailored suit. He wore a heavy wool sweater and carried a battered leather notebook, radiating an intense, quiet, and methodical authority. I sat down across from him and slid the thick binder Nora and I had assembled across the polished mahogany table. I did not waste his time with tears. I did not ramble about how much my feelings were hurt by my parents or how deeply I missed my husband. I spoke in a flat, clinical register. I walked him meticulously through the chronological timeline. I pointed to the exact hour of the covertly recorded porch conversation, the specific day the fraudulent guardianship petition was stamped by the court, the precise time my sister attempted to reroute the commercial property rent, and the afternoon my father tried to manipulate me into signing the general power of attorney. Elijah flipped through the color-coded pages, his eyes moving rapidly over the call logs and the high-resolution photographs of my father's desk. He stopped and looked up at me, his expression reflecting genuine professional respect. He stated that most victims of family fraud walk into his office as a hyperventilating, emotional mess, making it incredibly difficult to separate grief from actual legal violations by presenting an airtight, emotionless chain of evidence. I had just handed him a fully loaded legal weapon. The detective immediately zeroed in on the absolute linchpin of my family's entire scheme, the medical certificate signed by Dr. Victor Hale. Without that single piece of paper, their guardianship petition was nothing but a hollow threat. Elijah placed a call directly to the probate clerk and secured a certified, sealed copy of the medical submission within 45 minutes. We spread the freshly printed document out on the table. Elijah began to dismantle it line by line. The anomalies were glaring once a trained investigator pointed them out. The designated field for the actual date of the psychological examination was left completely blank. The clinical description of my supposed mental collapse read like a generic, copy-and-pasted template pulled straight from a textbook on acute trauma, lacking any specific personal details or nuanced behavioral observations. Most importantly, there were absolutely no supplementary medical charts, intake forms, or nursing notes attached to the formal declaration. Elijah tapped his pen against the paper and explained that corrupt professionals often get incredibly lazy. He immediately initiated a background verification into Dr. Hale's clinical operations. By late afternoon, Elijah had leveraged his badge to legally compel a preliminary review of the clinic's digital scheduling and billing software. The results were a devastating, mundane exposure of their lies. There was absolutely no appointment booked under my name anywhere near the date the certificate was signed. There was no record of a copayment processed, no insurance claim filed, and no visitor log entry indicating I had ever stepped foot inside his medical facility. It was a fatal, incredibly real-world loophole. They had secured the signature, but they had completely forgotten to fake the bureaucratic paper trail of an actual doctor's visit. I returned to my empty house that evening, the adrenaline slowly draining from my aching muscles. I went into the home office to file some of Grant's old banking statements, hoping the mundane task would ground me. I pulled his heavy gray fireproof lockbox from the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. As I sifted through our marriage certificate and the deed to our primary residence, my fingers brushed against a thick sealed envelope tucked into the very back corner. My breath caught sharply in my throat. Across the front of the envelope, written in Grant's familiar, slanted handwriting, was a strict instruction. It read, "Open only if you are being pressured to sign something." I sat down heavily on the hardwood floor, tearing the flap open with shaking hands. Inside was a single sheet of heavy legal paper containing a meticulously typed emergency contact list. Malcolm Reed's name and private cell phone number sat firmly at the very top. Tucked right behind the list was a handwritten letter from my husband. I read his words, my vision blurring with the first real tears I had shed in days. Grant wrote that he had spent years quietly observing the way my parents and sister treated me. He saw how they constantly belittled my intelligence and subtly tried to make me feel small and dependent. He explicitly stated that he never once doubted my strength, my intelligence, or my absolute capacity to manage our wealth. He only doubted them. Grant knew that if anything sudden ever happened to him, my family would view my devastating grief as a weakness to be exploited. He built this hidden financial and legal fortress and retained Malcolm. To ensure I would never be isolated or bullied into surrendering my life, that letter was not a legally binding piece of evidence. I could not submit it to a judge to prove fraud, but its psychological value was absolutely immeasurable. For the first week since Grant's death, I had been reacting out of sheer panic and defensive terror. Reading his profound declaration of faith in me permanently altered my internal architecture. I folded the letter and placed it carefully in my front pocket. I was no longer a victim scrambling in the dark. I was the rightful owner of my life, standing firmly inside the fortress my husband had built for me. I was finally ready to act like a person holding all the power. My phone rang at exactly 8 o'clock that evening. It was Detective Stone. His voice was completely devoid of its earlier conversational tone, replaced by the rigid, formal cadence of law enforcement. He informed me that the initial verification was complete. He confirmed that Dr. Hale had absolutely manufactured the medical evaluation at my father's request without ever conducting a physical or psychological assessment. Elijah paused, letting the heavy silence hang over the line for a brief moment before delivering the final verdict. He told me that if a licensed medical professional submits a fabricated diagnostic certificate to a judge to facilitate the seizure of an estate, the fundamental nature of our battle changes entirely. He said clearly, "If Hale signed without examining you, this is no longer a probate file. This is a criminal case." Following the strict strategic parameters laid out by Malcolm and Detective Stone, I did not immediately sever contact with my parents or my sister. Cutting them off would have alerted them that I was aware of their ambush. Instead, I transformed into the exact version of the broken, helpless widow they desperately needed me to be. I leaned into the exhaustion. I let my voice waver on phone calls. I created the distinct impression that I was hovering right on the edge of complete surrender and that I might actually agree to sign my life away if they just pushed a little harder. The bait worked flawlessly. Early Tuesday afternoon, my mother invited me to a private lunch at a quiet, dimly lit bistro across town. When I sat down in the booth across from her, I noticed her hands were actually shaking. Elaine ordered a glass of white wine and almost immediately began to cry. These were not the calculated, theatrical tears she had displayed at the family dinner. This was genuine, visceral panic. She poured out a carefully sanitized version of their financial reality, complaining about crushing inflation and bad investments my father had made. She was actively trying to drag me into her ocean of anxiety, attempting to weaponize my natural empathy to make me feel guilty for sitting on a fortune while my family drowned. Then, she smoothly pivoted back to the trap. She reached across the table, her tear-stained face forming a mask of maternal sacrifice. She begged me to just sign that one small piece of paper my father had brought over. She promised it was only temporary, just a simple way for him to handle the confusing taxes so I could rest. I maintained my character perfectly. I did not argue. I did not throw my water in her face. I looked down at my plate and asked a series of soft, innocent questions. I quietly asked if my father really had everything sorted out already. I asked if my signature was truly the very last step required. My mother, eager to close the deal, nodded vigorously. She verbally confirmed that Russell had prepared all the necessary legal frameworks and that they just needed my name on the dotted line to finalize the transition. I absorbed her confession in silence, committing every single word to memory while playing the role of the overwhelmed daughter while I was enduring that lunch. Detective Stone was executing a very different kind of strategy. Armed with a newly signed judicial warrant, Elijah's team descended upon Dr. Victor Hale's private clinic to compel the immediate release of my supposed medical records. The sudden, intense legal pressure caused the corrupt doctor's confidence to completely shatter. Faced with the terrifying prospect of losing his medical license and facing severe criminal fraud charges, Hale began to scramble for a lifeline. He did not offer a full, honorable confession, but he did provide a sworn statement that drastically shifted the blame. Hale admitted on the official record that my father was the one who initiated the contact. More importantly, Hale confessed that he had never conducted any form of psychiatric or physical evaluation on me. He stated that he had based his entire legally binding medical certificate on a typed summary of symptoms provided directly by my family. That admission alone was damning, but the subsequent digital investigation revealed a twist that made my blood run entirely cold. Elijah obtained the communication logs between my father and the doctor. When the investigative team cross-referenced the documents, they discovered the exact origin of the symptom summary. The highly clinical, devastating language describing my supposed mental collapse in Dr. Hale's certificate was not written by a medical professional. It was an almost verbatim copy of a draft email recovered from my younger sister's personal work computer. Brianna was not simply aware of the scheme. She was the chief architect of the narrative. My own sister had sat at her keyboard and meticulously fabricated my insanity, typing out the script of my destruction word by word. The pressure of their crumbling timeline finally pushed my father over the edge on Wednesday evening. He called my cell phone, completely abandoning the gentle, paternal tone he had used on my front porch. His voice was hot, aggressive, and laced with absolute panic. He demanded to know why I had not yet returned the signed power of attorney. I kept my voice incredibly soft, telling him I was just too confused by the legal jargon and needed a few more days to think. My hesitation caused him to absolutely explode. I immediately pressed the record button on my screen. Through the speaker, my father screamed that I was an ungrateful, foolish child who was going to ruin everything. In his blind rage, he explicitly admitted that he had already filed the conservatorship paperwork with the county. He then delivered a brutal, undeniable threat. He told me that if I dared to step into a courtroom to fight my own family, he would ensure I was thoroughly and publicly humiliated in front of the judge. He promised to expose every flaw I ever had until the court believed I was entirely unhinged. I waited for him to finish yelling, whispered a quiet apology, and hung up the phone. I drove straight to Malcolm's office the next morning and played the recording. The audio captured the explicit threat, the admission of filing, and the absolute malicious intent behind their actions. I fully expected Malcolm to file an emergency injunction to stop the entire process immediately. Instead, Malcolm leaned back in his leather chair and outlined a much more devastating plan. He deliberately chose not to file for a delay or a cancellation. We were going to let the scheduled probate hearing take place exactly as planned. Malcolm explained that stopping them now would only result in a quiet dismissal. He wanted them to walk into a court of law, stand before a sworn judge, and confidently tell their elaborate lies on the public record. We possessed the forensic psychiatric evaluation, the proof of medical fraud, the digital fingerprints of my sister's email, and the audio recordings of their threats. I walked out of Malcolm's office feeling a strange, profound sense of peace. I was no longer a victim crouching in a defensive posture. I was the hunter waiting patiently in the blind. I was simply going to hold the door open and let my parents and my sister walk directly into the courtroom, entirely fueled by their arrogant, fatal belief that I was still a soft, easily broken target. The final 48 hours before the hearing felt like the agonizing, breathless climb of a roller coaster just before the absolute drop. Inside Malcolm's secure conference room, we spent 2 entire days constructing a counteroffensive structured in 3 impenetrable layers of physical evidence. Layer 1 established my absolute legal capacity, anchored by the pristine, legally binding forensic psychiatric evaluation provided by Dr. Mercer. Layer 2 systematically dismantled their primary weapon, utilizing the digital logs and sworn statements to expose the undeniable medical fraud committed by Dr. Hale. Layer 3 was the definitive kill shot. It proved their undeniable, malicious intent to seize my assets, backed by the documented proof of my sister's corporate impersonation, my father's predatory power of attorney trap, and the crisp audio recordings of their porch conversation. Nora sat at the end of the long mahogany table, running on sheer adrenaline and black tea, refining our chronological spreadsheet down to the exact minute. She took all the disparate pieces of our nightmare and standardized the timeline. She perfectly aligned the timestamps of my family's actions with the exact date and hour the emergency petition was filed. We could now physically show the judge a terrifyingly clear picture. Nora's timeline proved that while my mother was crying over a plate of pasta and begging me to rest, my sister was simultaneously calling my human resources department to cut off my health benefits. And my father was actively threatening me over the phone. Every single lie was mapped, bound, and indexed. Detective Stone joined us on the final evening as the city lights flickered on outside the office windows. He leaned heavily against the wooden doorframe, holding a sealed manila envelope, and delivered the news we had been waiting for. He officially confirmed that he had presented our gathered evidence to the district attorney. The prosecutors agreed that they possessed more than enough concrete proof to immediately secure multiple arrest warrants for my family members. However, Elijah was holding the warrants back. He explained his litigation strategy with a grim, calculating smile. He deliberately wanted my parents and my sister to take the solemn oath. He needed them to confidently perjure themselves on the official court record, transforming their quiet, familial deception into a fully documented felony. Once they lied directly to a sitting judge, the trap would permanently snap shut. They remained completely blind to the danger awaiting them, absolutely convinced I was still entirely under their control. The night before the hearing, as I lay awake in my dark bedroom, my phone vibrated gently on the nightstand. It was a text message from Brianna. Her tone was sickeningly sweet, a complete, jarring departure from her usual sharp dismissiveness. She asked me to meet her at the courthouse 30 minutes early so we could have a private, sisterly chat in the hallway. It was a desperate, transparent attempt to manipulate my emotions right up until the gavel fell. Exactly 10 minutes later, another message arrived. This one was from my mother. It contained an attached image file. I opened it to find a faded, scanned photograph from my 7th birthday party. In the picture, I was smiling with a missing front tooth, sitting happily on my father's broad shoulders. Elaine had typed a short, highly emotional caption saying how much they both fiercely loved their little girl and how they only wanted to protect me. It was a staggering, grotesque psychological twist. My own mother was actively weaponizing my happiest childhood memories. She was treating my deep-seated nostalgia and my desperate desire for a loving family as just another tactical instrument to break my defenses. I stared at the glowing screen, realized I felt absolutely nothing but cold resolve, and powered the device down completely. When dawn broke on the morning of the hearing, the sky over Portland was a bruised, heavy shade of gray. I opened my closet and deliberately bypassed the sharp, tailored business suits I normally wore to corporate meetings. Instead, I reached straight for the heavy black wool coat I had worn to Grant's funeral. I did not choose it to play the role of the weeping, tragic widow for the court. I put it on as a heavy piece of psychological armor. The thick fabric still carried the faint, lingering memory of the freezing rain from that terrible day at the cemetery. I needed to wear it to remind my own heart that the absolute truth of this nightmare did not start today. The truth started the exact moment I stood shivering on their front porch, listening to them casually carve up the remainder of my life. I met Malcolm in the echoing marble lobby of the county courthouse. He pulled me aside near a massive stone pillar, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritative register. He gave me my absolute survival rules for the upcoming battle. He ordered me not to engage in any emotional arguments, no matter what lies they told. If the opposing counsel or my family tried to deliberately provoke me, I was to remain completely stone-cold silent. If the judge asked me a direct question, I was to answer with the shortest, most concise sentence possible. I was instructed to keep my eyes locked entirely on the bench, never once looking back at my parents or my sister. Malcolm firmly told me to step back, maintain my dignity, and let the lawyer and the physical evidence do all the bleeding for me. As we walked toward the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, Elijah fell into step right beside us. He did not say a word, but he gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. He gestured slightly toward the end of the long corridor. Two plainclothes police officers were standing casually near the main exit doors, reading the morning newspaper. Elijah had quietly secured the perimeter. He anticipated that once Malcolm started dropping our devastating evidence, my family might panic, attempt to formally withdraw their guardianship petition, and run for the doors to avoid facing the consequences. Elijah made it crystal clear that even if they tried to flee, the criminal investigation would not simply vanish into thin air. Their actions had long ago crossed the legal threshold from a tragic family dispute into a premeditated criminal conspiracy. I pushed open the heavy double doors of the probate courtroom at exactly 8:30 in the morning. The air inside smelled faintly of old paper and lemon wood polish. I looked straight down the center aisle. Sitting together in the very front row, dressed in somber, conservative clothing, were Russell, Elaine, and Brianna. As I walked down the aisle, my mother immediately plastered a look of agonizing concern across her face. My father sat up straighter, trying to project the image of a strong, protective patriarch shielding his flock. My sister offered me a tight, highly practiced, sympathetic smile. They were sitting there acting exactly as if they had come to gracefully save me from my own broken mind. I kept my face perfectly blank, walking right past them without breaking my stride to take my seat at the defense table. My heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm beneath my black coat. I knew exactly what they did not. Today was the day the final masks were going to fall. The heavy wooden doors of the probate courtroom closed firmly behind me, sealing us inside. The presiding judge, an older man with sharp, tired eyes, called the emergency hearing to order. My father was the first to speak. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and delivered an Oscar-worthy performance. His voice was thick with manufactured sorrow as he told the judge that I was completely unable to manage my finances after the sudden shock of losing my husband. He painted a picture of a woman wandering aimlessly through a large house, forgetting to pay bills, and actively endangering her own future. My mother sat right beside him, dabbing the corners of her eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the heartbroken mother who only wanted to step in and protect her vulnerable daughter from the harsh realities of the world. Then, the judge turned his attention to my younger sister. Brianna stood up, projecting an aura of innocent, exhausted helpfulness. She stated clearly on the public record that her involvement was strictly limited to logistical support. She claimed she was only trying to organize groceries and clean my house. She explicitly distanced herself from any legal decisions and flatly denied contacting any external parties or acting as my guardian. She swore she was just a worried sibling standing by her parents. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on my lap, watching them weave their fragile web of lies directly in front of a sworn officer of the court. Malcolm Reed stood up slowly from our defense table. He did not raise his voice. He did not inject a single ounce of theatrical drama into the room. He simply opened his leather briefcase and handed the bailiff the first document. It was the comprehensive forensic psychiatric evaluation from Dr. Mercer. Malcolm stated that the report was conducted by a court-approved specialist mere hours after my family initiated their plot. The judge put on his reading glasses and scanned the heavy stock paper. I watched the lines on the judge's forehead deepen. The entire foundation of my supposed mental incapacity crumbled into dust within 60 seconds. The judge looked over the rim of his glasses, his gaze suddenly turning very cold as it landed on my father. Malcolm did not give them a single moment to recover. He moved directly to the medical certificate submitted by the plaintiffs. He pointed out the blatantly invalid, blank date fields. He then officially called Detective Elijah Stone, who was present under subpoena, to provide a factual statement regarding the ongoing county investigation. Elijah stepped forward, his posture rigid and commanding. He informed the court that Dr. Victor Hale had already provided a sworn confession. The detective stated clearly that Hale admitted to signing the certificate without ever conducting a physical or psychological examination on me. Furthermore, Elijah confirmed that Dr. Hale explicitly named Russell Holt as the man who approached him with a pre-written script of my symptoms. The color instantly drained from my father's face. He sank back into his heavy wooden chair, the illusion of the protective patriarch completely destroyed. Then, Malcolm dropped the absolute hammer. He submitted the digital audio files into evidence. The bailiff played the recordings through the courtroom speakers. My parents and my sister were forced to sit in agonizing, deafening silence as their own voices echoed off the marble walls. They listened to themselves standing on my porch, laughing about selling my coastal cabin and plotting to bribe a corrupt doctor. They listened to the frantic phone call where my father screamed at me, actively threatening to humiliate me in this exact room if I did not sign a predatory power of attorney. Malcolm concisely pointed out that the timestamps of their threats perfectly matched the exact day they filed the emergency petition. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the rain hitting the tall glass windows. But Malcolm had one final twist, specifically reserved for my sister, to completely shatter Brianna's perjury. Malcolm submitted the sworn affidavits and communication logs from the property manager and the human resources director at Northline Civic Design. He proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Brianna had actively impersonated a legal guardian to hijack my commercial rent and cut off my corporate salary days before this judge had even opened the file. She had not been organizing groceries. She had been actively executing a hostile financial takeover. The judge did not even bother asking my family's attorney for a rebuttal. He slammed his gavel down with a sharp, violent crack. He dismissed their petition with prejudice, meaning they could never file it again. His voice shook with genuine anger as he declared their actions a gross, predatory abuse of the probate system. He then announced that he was officially transferring the entire case file to the district attorney for immediate criminal prosecution. The hearing was over. I stood up, smoothed the front of my black wool coat, and walked down the center aisle. I did not look back. When I pushed through the double doors into the bright corridor, the reality of Elijah's meticulous planning materialized. The plainclothes law enforcement officers stepped directly into the path of my family. They approached Russell and Brianna, quietly instructing them to step against the wall. My mother was handed a strict, court-ordered document prohibiting her from contacting me while the district attorney investigated her role as an active accomplice. I walked right past them. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just felt incredibly quiet, completely awake, and profoundly free. 6 months have passed since that morning in court. I sold the house in Portland and moved permanently to the cabin near Cannon Beach. I spend my mornings walking along the shoreline and my afternoons taking intensive courses on commercial real estate and wealth management. Grant's financial legacy is secure, but I maintain absolute, unbreakable boundaries. I do not answer calls from unlisted numbers, and I do not entertain apologies sent through distant relatives. Looking out at the ocean, I finally understand the greatest lesson of this entire nightmare. The most powerful proof I possessed was never the audio recordings or the medical evaluations. The real proof was the moment I stopped begging for their love and completely refused to let anyone else define my capacity to control my own life. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from, and if you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.